God damn. Welcome to the 2-Month Review, the weekly podcast brought to you by Open Letter and 3%, in which we take a giant book, break it down bit by bit, section by section, talk about it, analyze it, have a good time. I'm Chad Post from Open Letter Books, and this season, our 16th, we are doing 2666 by Roberto Bolaño, and today we are covering the part about Amalfitano, which is the second part of the book, and we're covering it in full because it's essentially like a 70-page novella. I am joined, as always, by Brian Wood, author of Joytime Killbox.
Hello, Chad. Good to be here.
You don't seem as fresh and awake as you do when you're here in the house.
I'm super hungover, but I'm loving life. So let's go.
Let's do this. I feel you, man. I'm not hungover. I'm a little groggy though, and I got a sick kid, and we all have to go in 20 minutes. So this is gonna be short.
Is anybody ever a little hungover, or is it always super hungover?
It's never.
I barely made it to brunch. I'm not even kidding. It's bad.
Oh my God, you're such a millennial.
And joined also by Katie Whittemore, translator of dozens of books and Bolaño expert.
That's not true.
Somebody who actually works and has a work ethic. Katie,
somebody who actually does things and the good one on the podcast.
Well, I'm glad to be here amid the dozens of books that I've translated and all the things I know about Bolaño. So just
perfect.
Bringing the expertise.
Real quick for everyone is that Katie and I did an interview with Emily Hall, the author of the Longcut and editor at MoMA, and that will occur at the end of this, the audio version of this podcast. So if you're watching us live, this is going to be a short, but if you're listening to us on the audio, you get a lot of backup about Duchamp, about the artwork on the 3 volumes of the books, about Edward Johns, about a little bit about Edward Johns, and about the Readymade that Amalfitano makes. But we probably won't cover most of those topics since they're covered later on, but instead we can jump right in here since we don't have a ton of time. And I know, Katie, you wanted to talk about his wife and her madness.
Well, I think that this whole section is pretty heavily pointing to madness and sort of introducing madness. You know, if we had voids and if we had pits and if we had the abyss and all of that and violence, now we're bringing in the madness. And I think Amalfitano, we can talk about what the voice that he hears might be or might represent, and if he's mad or if he's not mad. And then of course we have his estranged wife Lola, who goes off the rails and leaves him and abandons their daughter when she's very young to go and basically try to spring a poet from a Basque insane asylum, Mondragon, and take him off to live in France. And so there's just layers and layers of madness. Like Amalfitano is telling us about, we're hearing, or basically, well, the narrator's telling us, but sort of through Amalfitano's vision of his ex-wife, and then her madness, and then the madness of the poet, the supposed madness of the poet that's in the asylum, and some of the other, they're not called inmates. What are they called in English? Patients.
Clients? I was going to say clients, which is maybe
They're
worse.
not clients. That seems like very current moment to call everybody a client.
Yeah, exactly.
Good customer service. You can always get good customer service at the loony bin.
So you noticed a theme of madness running through this section. Did you notice any other? I want to get through all these, obviously, but Chad, what did you notice that echoed through this?
So the thing that I was going to say is, if we want to frame really quick, I'm sure that people who are watching this or listening have read this section, but the quick version, elevator pitch story of it is that Amalfitano, who was the one who helped the critics in part 1 when they got to Santa Teresa, he is a professor of philosophy. His wife Lola leaves him, sends him a bunch of crazy letters where she goes to see this poet, as you mentioned, Katie, and then he moves to Santa Teresa for this job, lives in this kind of weird space at the nicer part of town, but also feels like at the edge of town, given like how deserted it is, in the sense that they're surrounded by a fence that has glass shards in the top of it to prevent people from coming in or out. There are lots of murders that are going on in Santa Teresa. He is a bit worried about his daughter. He finds the geometry book he doesn't remember. He hangs it up on the clothesline to let nature commune with it and see if it will learn anything. And then he has an encounter with the dean's son, in which the dean's son takes him out to get mezcal and get their asses kicked, or almost, or attempt to. And then he slowly starts hearing voices in his head and starts going a little bit crazy himself, has a great dream about what humanity is. And that's pretty much the section. The thing that I wanted to pair with what you're asking about, Brian, and what you just talked about, Katie, was that the madness that runs throughout here, I also feel like is sort of the flip side of these people's attempt to understand. That there's a lot of like attempting to understand in here, and that there is like a secret message somewhere, either in the geometry book or like hidden right beneath the surface, where all the hellfire is, where all the pits are, where all the violence is, that once people get close to, they start going a little bit crazy. And so I see those two things as linked. And we were talked for a minute. One of the other books, there's 2 books in this section, the geometry book that he hangs up on the clothes wire, and then another one that's about the history of the liberator of Chile. It's a real figure. Is it Bernardo O'Higgins? Something like that. O'Higgins is the main. Alex has informed me it's Leonardo, because he is an expert on Chilean history. But the book is about whether O'Higgins was born to was actually like a native Chilean, native Chilean. I don't know what the right terms are. Indigenous, native Chilean, whatever. Indigenous Chilean. I didn't fuck that all up. Did I get there? Anyways, and this particular tribe believed that they had powers of telepathy, and that when they were colonized by the Spanish, the only reason their telepathy stopped, the only reason they didn't win, was because the British or the Spanish killed all of their telepaths. And they had created then other ways of communicating through like branches that move, possibly like smoke signals. Also, they have a language of triangles. And so I see these things as kind of bouncing back and forth between the madness and this like communication. And that might even tie into like, what is Bolaño doing here as an artist trying to communicate the horror of the world? But by doing so, you're essentially sending people into madness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Brian?
Well, yeah, like spinning off of that, I mean, really what are books and what is reading? It's looking at dead trees and hallucinating. You know, I mean, that's, or I'm noticing too, between these first 2 sections, this desire for connection and loneliness. And the strange, like this oxymoronic way in which by being alone with a text, you can have an intimate connection with something or someone. It's like, so these are kind of neat things that I think maybe he's kind of circling around in this. But in this section, I noticed along with madness and along with geometry, which I try not to think about too often. I also noticed cemeteries popped up quite a bit, ghosts popped up throughout, and then homosexuality is strung through this one as well. So I thought those were really neat things that he toys with in this as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned ghosts, because there's somewhere in part 1 where I circled and mentioned or wrote a note in the sideline I'm trying to find in the margin that just said ghosts, because I feel like ghosts are going to show up off and on throughout here, and then that felt like a moment where that was like a foreshadowing.
It's interesting that in this section too, like Amalfitano, when he's trying to think about, well, what is the voice? Who is the voice? What could the voice be? And he says, could it be, is it a ghost? And then he says, no, it's not a ghost, but it's probably just a lost soul. And so there's like this difference, this distinction he's drawing between, a regular ghost and then a wandering lost soul that has something to, I guess, do in order to in order to be like free from the wandering, I suppose. You know, with the cemetery, Brian, I noticed that too, and I think we should talk about that. And I think, as an extension of the cemetery vision, I think that death is so present in this whole section. Just death, you know, death in general, death, failure, and decadence. Like, I think that things here start to feel like stuff really starting to crumble, and be in decline. Whether that's the university, whether that's our ability to really have faith in, I think, academic texts. I think there's a real critique. You know, Chad, when you mentioned the book about the I think it's Aura Canianos. I don't know in English how they pronounce it, but you know, the indigenous Chilean tribe, and I think, like, the book is so absurd. When Amalfitano starts breaking the book, he's like, okay, he's a philosophy professor, and I think he's trying to use his like logic, his proofs, you know, and they talk about it being proofs. Like, here's the proof that this person is, you know, who I say he is. And they don't make any sense. And he's like, okay, well, it would follow that. And it's just like, all Chileans are telepaths. Like,
yeah.
You know, so, you know, I think that there's a real, like, sort of almost parodic undercutting of academic knowledge. And then we have, on the flip side of that, and this intent to try to order things. And this is something we talk about a lot with Emily in the other interview. But
just real quick though, do you think that like the academic knowledge, do you think that's kind of playing off? I mean, there's something sort of farcical about our quartet in the first section, right?
Yeah.
And do you think this kind of also is another note in that chord?
Yes.
Okay.
I do. I think that there's a critique of the university in this work in general, and like sort of academia, but I think it goes beyond just those institutions, and I think it's a critique of possibly of utopia. I mean, I wish we got to go back to all of these things, but you know, if you think about what Latin American intellectuals were doing in the latter half of the 20th century, and there was, you know, the movements, the socialist utopian movements that ended in Latin America in crushing violent repression and dictatorship.
Like 76 in Chile.
Yeah, and in Argentina too. And so, like, you know, there's an interest, I think, in a lot of Bolaño's work, an interest in this generation of Latin American intellectuals and artists who are sort of like in the Latin American tradition, one and the same, right? Because you both write and you write criticism. You both, you know, you're a poet and you're a critic. And I think that what it's pointing to too is that, like, you know, the creation of art and politics were one and the same in those revolutionary movements. Like, an artist was a revolutionary, and there was a commitment, and then there was this failure of those movements and the failure of the utopias, and the flip side of those things was not only dictatorship, but those dictatorships then paved the way for like this like crazy expansion of the global economy and of this late capitalism, which Santa Teresa is like the scene of that. And the crimes that we're starting to get hints of, you know, are the result of those things. So I think that there's a line being drawn throughout, like, 20th century political failures, failed revolution, failed utopias that lead all to this kind of violence, and that the university, right, or that systems of knowledge are somehow, if not like implicated in that, they are at least completely ill-equipped to deal with it.
Yeah, like, can I add to that really quick?
Yeah,
it feels like, so going back to what you're saying about the Latin American revolutionaries, there were theorists and writers that were connected to a life, and the university was a spot of resistance. And now the university is not a spot of resistance in Santa Teresa. And the idea of like categorizing, ordering, delineating, creating knowledge, defining what that knowledge is, has become an act in which, like, if you define what went wrong in Latin America, you essentially spread that evil. I think this is something that we sort of started to touch on with them later on as well, but is that that writing about the crimes and like knowing about these things is also making them more prevalent. Like you can't, you can't resist the evil that's in the world simply by explaining it. That doesn't stop it. That almost creates more of it. Like, I want you to know that World War II was this bad. And then, so to some people, that's like, I don't know that they need to know that was even possible because they're crazy people. Kyle Rittenhouse, for instance, the hero.
Well, it's interesting to think about this vision of the university when Bolaño was writing in, the early 2000s. And the idea that already then the university was a cemetery. The university was an empty disco, an empty dance floor or whatever, And so at that point, it's already just corrupt and blank. And not a place of resistance, Chad, as you mentioned, and not a place of politics, and not a place of ideals, we could say then too. So already in 2000, that's happening. And then you think about, how far that's even come in the last 20 years to think about, so I guess it's like maybe a distinction between sort of like what the university was supposed to represent and what a neoliberal university is. And because it's really looking at like, well, what is it now potentially, but in the early 2000s, it's so inextricably linked with business and with the market and with making money, and whatever is not profitable gets cut. And we just see that happening now too, but that's been happening for 20 years. The debates about the liberal arts and about having a philosophy department, funding a philosophy department when there are, 3 majors. Sylvie wants to contribute. Okay, go ahead. I'll be right with you. We have a comment. But so anyway, I think that's interesting here.
Yeah, man. Having been at university since the year 2000, I can tell you that profit centers have become the buzzword for a while. And hitting a little close to home there, Kate.
Well, yeah.
But that was going to be my line of the week initially, was the one that you just referenced about the university. I'm going to change it to something else, but specifically, it's the University of Santa Teresa was like a cemetery with only been for think in vain. And it was also was like an empty dance club.
Yeah. So wonderful. I know we all have to go. Everybody has their kids in the background. I can hear yours, and mine's like, I have to go to the bathroom.
For juice.
I'll be right with you. But there's we're not going to have time to go through like some of the really great stuff. I wonder if we should propose. We keep reading, but maybe there's a couple ideas that we can circle back to, or even report on our own.
We don't have to be like super strict.
Thanks.
Nobody's
cares.
Nobody's like
on your pages. Well, there's two things that I think we're going to want to talk about, and then I would propose that you guys think about, because I'd like to know your thoughts. Is that okay? Can I give you this task? Okay. So one is the idea of in this section, the introduction of politics through a couple of different ways, and specifically socialism, Marxism. Okay, so talking a little bit about Chile and about Chile, he sort of gives some good jabs at Chilean society, but then the dream that Amalfitano ends with Yeltsin, and the idea of like, well, what is life? Like basically, it's like, I'm going to tell you the secret to life. I'm going to tell you what the third leg of the human chair is. And it's supply
plus demand plus magic.
Plus magic.
It is.
So
I don't have time to run my full joke, but there's a Billie Eilish Ocular VR concert that I believe is supply plus demand plus magic. Yeah. I saw this video kind of out of it on Hulu. Like, what the fuck am I watching? But really, I'll link to it. You should watch it, because basically what it shows is the concert of Billie Eilish in which people are playing a video game as they dance to her songs, slicing up random creations. Like it's like literally like a VR World concert. It's very bizarre. It is filled with magic.
Okay, and supply and demand. It sounds
And
like.
supply. There's one Billie Eilish. There's a lot of demand, so they made a VR concert app.
Are there Dionysian mists?
There is a very heavy Dionysian vibe. Yes,
because that's important here.
There is. Yep. Nope. It's this commercial is this thing just like made into something shitty and horrible at late capitalist moment.
Oh my God.
You need to have a lot of mezcal to get dreams like this, I think.
Yeah,
yeah, you do.
The real shit.
We should try this. I think you're calling for an experiment.
Ooh.
The one thing I want to point out, there's two things I want to point out that aren't thoughtful like Katie recommendations. But one is that I love that when she writes him the letter, Lola writes him the letter, and one of the first letters that is printed in here, and he's going, and it's like sort of makes sense, and then she's like, Emma is a lesbian. Every day, hundreds of thousands of cows are sacrificed. Every day, a herd of herbivores or several herds cross the valley from north to south, so slowly but so fast it makes me sick. Right now. Do you understand, Oscar? No, thought Amalfitano, I don't. What happened in the last chapter where like he gives his speech about on the stage and the pit.
I don't know a word you're speaking about. Yeah.
I don't know what you just said.
I don't know either. And then there's a reference to boxing, which I think is a hook for anyone who is reading this for the first time. They talk about his dad and the boxing. And the final thing that I thought was interesting that I named this after and that I'd like to come back to, this is one to think about later, is the reference in the middle here called that says he remembered, but fleetingly as one remembers a lightning bolt, Ramon Llull and his fantastic machine, fantastic in its uselessness. And that struck me because the Ramon Llull Institute is what funds all our Catalan books. Ramon Llull is a Catalan poet. I didn't know what this was, so I looked it up. And it's essentially like a crazy ass drawing of what would be like a computer, like a way of like calculating things. It was like a machine to calculate things, which ties in the geometry of this. And it is some connection between like the physical sciences and the poetry side of things and like what that balance is. So I think that that's something that I'd like to come back to in a future episode if we have time. But it stood out to me just solely because that didn't.
Because Ramon Llull
and like machine words I see together. Ryan, you got anything you want to leave with?
No, I just had a good time. This was a kind of it felt like a strange aside of a section, but it connects perfectly with a lot of the themes and echoes that we've had from the first section.
And it takes place before the first section.
Yeah.
Because the critics see the book hanging in the backyard.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
So
I think that we are going to want to go back also to what I think is like a central quote for the whole book, which is on page 227. And it's when Amalfitano is thinking about, the sad paradox of the erudite, the learned pharmacist.
Yes.
Okay, and he's talking about like the works that people choose to engage with, like the Metamorphosis or Bartleby or A Christmas Carol, right? And he says, what a sad paradox, thought Amalfitano. Now even bookish pharmacists are afraid to take on the great, imperfect, torrential works, books that blaze paths into the unknown. They choose the perfect exercises of the great masters, or what amounts to the same thing. They want to watch the great masters spar, but they have no interest in real combat. When the great masters struggle against that something that terrifies us all, that something that cows us and spurs us on amid blood and mortal wounds and stench. And so I would like, my question for you guys, and anybody who wants to put anything in the chat, is what is that something? Okay, in Spanish, it's aquello, right? So aquello, we're talking about, it's a noun. What is that thing that the great masters are doing combat with in these grand, imperfect, torrential works? And I think there's lots of different ways that we can conceive of that something. And I'm curious about people's opinions on that. And then my sentence was, I think for all the sadness and all the sort of like pitiful sort of failures of Amalfitano, I think the saddest thing about him is his lunch of boiled chicken in the university cafeteria. Now, if that's not a failed intellectual.
Having had chicken at the university cafeteria yesterday, I will admit that is an abyss.
Is it definitely? But was it boiled? Because it's the boiledness.
No, it wasn't
That was the problem for me.
I'm sure that that's a possible ordering thing in the University of Rochester's realm of fine dining.
I'm going to ask. That's what I want to ask Natasha Wimmer when we talk to her. Natasha, in the original, it says this. Like, how did you choose boiled as the description for the chicken? Was it not poached? Could it not have been the boiled chicken?
That is so funny. We do have some responses real quick, and then we'll have to go from the people watching in response to your idea of the something from the void, the abyss, trying to impose European ideas of order on the craziness of actual life, which is interesting, which is something we talk about. And from our future guest, Emily Hall, mentions that her favorite line is, all he saw was a dog heading calmly towards Avenida Madero to the bus stop.
Yeah. It's fine. It's like nothing. There's nothing to see here. Everything's fine in Santa Teresa.
It's all good. There was one other line I really liked, but I can't find it now, about poetry.
On 226.
Yeah, 226. Yeah. Now all I read is poetry. Poetry is the one thing that isn't contaminated, the one thing that isn't part of the game. I don't know if you follow me, Professor. Only poetry, and let me be clear, only some of it is good for you. Only poetry isn't shit.
Yeah.
And nobody reads poetry.
Everybody just.
This is the degradation that we have.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sorry. I am being summoned. I'm gonna have to run.
I have to go to a doctor's appointment.
I have to bring the kids back to school.
All of us with these kids. So everyone who is watching this, please download the audio and listen to the additional part. I think you'll very much enjoy it.
I should just say that whatever happened today, however interesting or entertaining anyone found it, the conversation with Emily Hall is thrice that. It's really great. Emily's amazing, and she's a genius, and she gives a ton of great information about some of the art references.
It's really interesting, especially to sell this a little bit more. It picks up on the thread of like the organization, the idea of knowledge, and that's come up here at the end and that we touched upon. But yeah, so if you're watching, please rate, review, do all the fun things, tell your friends to listen, tell them to download, and we will be back next week with the first half of the next part, which is the part about fate.
Dun, dun, dun.
How many days in life will I spend underground? I was in total, as many as it takes, and how many ways of feeling lousy have I found? Lately uncounted, I found a reason to exist. Blaming my time, on the time for
Okay, now we're joined by Emily Hall, editor at MoMA and author of the forthcoming novel, The Longcut, who is, in her own words, not an art expert or art historian, but does know quite a bit about art and learned a lot about art, and is here to talk to us about various artistic acts or artistic entry points to 2666. So welcome, Emily.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hi, Emily.
Hi.
And as always, we're joined by Katie Whittemore.
Hello, all.
You've been on the whole time, so it makes no difference. So Emily,
Yeah, as always, as three, as
it's just there. So Emily, how did you come to read 2666?
I came to read it because you were doing the 2 month review. Well, I have been looking at, Open Letter for a while, ever since my association with Dalkey Archive started, and I'm very interested in Latin American writers. And I read Savage Detectives some time ago, really some time ago. And then a few years ago, I tried to read it in Spanish, but my Spanish is so, I don't know, I gave up because every time I looked up a word, it seemed to be slang for penis. And I was like, I'm not going to, so to speak, penetrate this book. So in Spanish. So And then I read Little Lumpen Novelita, which I have to say I didn't really grab me the way I feel like he's long form. Like I love him long form. And I started reading 2666 and I'm reading it in this state of ecstasy. Like I can't believe how fast it goes. I'm partway through the crimes part and I can't believe that's going so fast because of the subject matter. So that, that's the answer.
That's interesting. The Little Lumpen Novelita, that was the one that was written as part of the commissioned series in which Random House Mondadori asked, I think it was 6 writers to write about a different city the year 2000 or for the year 2000. And he was assigned, is it Rome that's the center of that book? I forget, whatever Italian city it is. And Frazan wrote Mantra, which is one of his big ass books on Mexico City that's coming out some point in the future from us. But those were part of that series. So it's like a weird book for within his oeuvre, in fact.
I think there's a whole separate conversation we could have about commissioned books.
Yeah.
Like the series on, re-seeing Shakespeare characters. Like there was an Edward St. Aubin one that, I love him and I couldn't read it. So anyway, I think that would be a whole separate.
That is really interesting. It is really interesting. So one thing we wanted to talk about first, I think, before we get into any specifics from the Amalfitano. I don't know why I always stumble on that. This will definitely have occurred prior to anyone listening to this conversation. But we wanted to talk about the book as an object, and that you have the same one that I do, the 3-volume version.
But what is the publication history of that? Did it come out in a single volume at the same time in English?
It came out as a single hardcover at the same time with the cover from the first volume as the cover of the hardcover. And at the same time, the 3-volume paperback came out and they were the same price. And then a year later, the single volume paperback came out. That was the one that Brian has. That's like just one big thick, like much more cheaply produced, not that is crap, but like clearly it's like the thinner paper size, everything to be able to fit into like more of a traditional size book. But yeah, so the two, they did them simultaneously, which is from a business perspective, sort of risky because you don't know if one's going to really sell and one's not. And if you get stuck with one or get stuck with the other, that could be problematic. But they were both like uniformly desired, it seemed like. Although I personally prefer the 3-volume one to the single large hardcover.
When it came out, you saw it a lot in New York City on the subways. I mean, rather than carrying a single huge volume, you could carry a part of one. My husband bought it, and I'm afraid it's gotten very bashed in our various moves. It's really sad how.
Oh no! Look at that.
This is probably a collector's item now, and I've mistreated it. Or
so the galley, which is a collector's item as well that a lot of people still have, was just this brown, the brown of the outside of the slipcase cover. It was just essentially that. And I ripped mine into pieces to be able to read it. So I took a valuable collector's item and just literally destroyed that book.
So you talked about the Moreau cover, right? Already, this sort of, it's like this crazy moment of revelation, which I think is interesting because to me, these 3 covers together suggest these different approaches to knowledge and to understanding. That this is this sort of like all in a moment, like Flannery O'Connor's Scorched Earth, moment of revelation. And the middle volume is, there's something called show notes, right? Where you can put images for people. Is that how it works? I'll give you some images to put in them because I'm not going to be able to show this very well. But the second volume, which is the one that contains the part about the crimes, has a cover of a painting by Twombly. And Twombly was an artist. He was born in Virginia and is sort of associated with the abstract expressionists in New York in the 1950s, but is really of the next generation of them. And his work is very much, I mean, it's scribbles. Like he's just sort of scribbling all over canvases. And that is very reductive, because when you look at this up close, and I'll give you an image of looking at the surface of this up close, it's made with, hang on, it's house paint, crayon, pencil, and pastel on canvas. And you can see that some of the marks lie on top of the paint, the pencil marks, some of them are underneath the paint, maybe erased. And some of them are just gouged right into it. So it's this varying levels of things that look like writing, but are impenetrable. Although I have to say that when you look at the whole painting, it's of Academy, which is the whole painting, I'm pretty sure you can see the word fuck in it.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, there you can see letters, and you can't see it on the cover. It's sort of to the lower left, you can see the CK, maybe.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll put in the full one. So the tension of this work, and I'm just gonna, if it's okay, I'm going to quickly read a quote from Kirk Varnado, who is a sort of legendary MoMA curator. He was the chief curator of painting and sculpture in the 90s. About the intensity of Twombly's work. It's intermittently casual, furious, self-doubling, self-annulling, an anxiety compounded of impetuosity and frustration, obsessiveness and idle disregard, transgression and self-doubt. And I think this so well kind of encapsulates the pressure of these works, that there's something that both want to be understood and then keep you at bay from understanding. And this was a bit of a departure from, the abstract expressionist Jackson Pollock beforehand, and AbX was understood as this sort of explosion of emotion that is kind of resolved in the painting, centralized and resolved. And the anxiety of a Twombly work kind of goes beyond the borders of the work. It just keeps going. And so, am I talking too much? Does someone want to?
No.
This is fascinating.
No.
So to contrast that with the third volume, which is this sort of these illustrations of, I think they're coral. They're coral specimens, and this comes from a volume taken from the Cabinet of Curiosities of Albertus Seba, or Seba. He was a Dutch pharmacist and collector and a few other things. And he had what was called a Cabinet of Curiosities, which in the 16th and 17th century, it was actually a room, and it was built for display with sort of cabinets you could open and drawers you pull out. And people tended to be like aristocrats, princes, but also wealthy merchants would collect samples of things. So they would be like taxidermied animals or shells or artifacts from other cultures, weapons. So it would be sociological, biological, natural history, ritualistic, some art, antiquities. And they were sort of, they were about wonder in a sense, but they were also about kind of showing how civilized you were. I mean, there was very much a narrative imposed on these things. And sometimes a narrative meant to kind of establish social order and keep a social order. Sometimes the things were fake. There were fake creatures. I saw an illustration, maybe Victoria and Albert Museum, I can't remember which, where there were like little skeletons arranged in a tableau playing violins, like almost like a Dia de los Muertos, but not quite. It was like a sort of memento mori. So it is this very hazy, real, not real collection. So Albertus Seba hired someone to illustrate his Cabinet of Curiosities. And in a flash of enthusiasm, I ordered a used copy of the book, but it hasn't arrived yet, so I can't show you anything. But they're very taxonomic. They very much impose an order on the collection and on the idea of the natural world, and sometimes unnatural. So the contrast between these two, I just found so fascinating. And that's when I first thought I want to talk on this podcast, because the idea of trying to order something that's fundamentally unorderable.
Mhm.
This novel, and again, I've only read half of it now, but as the whole of the detective story, the search for Arcimboldi, the murders that have so far in my reading gone unsolved. It's a problem to be solved and ordered, but even if you solve it, someone's dead, someone's being murdered.
Right.
So it's this pull between the solvable and the unsolvable.
Mhm.
And I feel that very strongly in the Amalfitano section.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I think that's that's most of what I have to say about the covers.
Yeah, I think, when you read the quote from the MoMA curator, it was like, oh, he could have been describing perhaps part of the way that I view Bolaño's enterprise in this novel, the attempt to narrate, right, or to physically put down what really ultimately is indecipherable. And that, like, whoever is reading it, whoever is viewing it, and again, I think this ties in with even how the critics view Arcimboldi's work. Like, however you approach the scribbles, right? Something will always, no matter what your interpretation is, something will always escape you.
Yes.
And there's this constant sense of, like, the meaning is there and we cannot grasp it.
Mhm.
And I think that's really interesting, especially with the Amalfitano section, because, looking at him as a philosophy professor and as someone who was part of the academy, and it's like, I just picture him, he's just like standing there with his eyes wide open, like gobsmacked and unable to really process, like, what is happening around him. And I'm curious about the third cover, Emily, that you brought up with the illustrations of the Cabinet of Curiosities, and the idea of, of ordering that which maybe the attempt to order what is ultimately unorderable. And I think you mentioned the word wonder, which I think we have to go back to. It's like there is, again, that sense of the ineffable, right? That pervades, I think, Bolaño's work, and that is some of these enterprises that, people taking on these projects to try to you're producing wonder at the same time that you're trying to manage it. And that, again, there's something inescapable about that. But I loved that you used that word. And I think there's something to that in the novel as well. The marvelous, the exaggerated.
You talked in the El Cerdo episode about Amalfitano's monologue about the proscenium with the, what is it behind, like a mine shaft or an opening, which I think and at the end he says, oh, I'm just talking nonsense, but in fact it's so key. What he's saying there is so key. That's a void behind him. It's one of those voids that appears throughout the novel, and all these intellectuals, these academics, are sitting with their ear to the void, and they're trying to make sense of it for the audience. And it's about making meaning, like who's getting to make meaning, and what's the nonsense. There's so many details so far in the book. I feel like I have to keep qualifying it. So far in the book that seem full of portent and full of significance, but then they pass by and they're never seen again. And the one I keep thinking of is Liz Norton in her hotel room is hearing a hum that she can't identify, and it's very intense, but then you never hear about the hum again. You never find out what it is, or she never refers to it again. And it just, it this buildup of what might be relevant and what might not be relevant. Feels like these voices emanating from, or the sounds, they're not even voices, emanating from this mind. What is it, a mine shaft? I can't remember what but it's like a big hole.
Yeah, I think it's just defined as a big hole, but you just brought to mind two things. One is that, because it's been a couple episodes since the David Lynch reference, that hum that she hears is like, in the new Twin Peaks, there is a scene that's exactly like that. In the one guy's office, they keep hearing a hum in different places and it never gets explained. It's never referenced again. It's one of those, that sort of idea of like the signal and what does it mean and how do you interpret it comes up a lot in this particular Amalfitano section in terms of language and of like, how do you communicate? So like the communication by telepathy or by like tree branches or by triangles. They have a language that's unknown that's written in triangles. Like that shit is like how to communicate and like how do you interpret, and like you say, like, is that symbol important or just passing by? All these in that. And one of the things that's at the end here real quick is that it says the very end of his section, a third leg, he's having a dream in which Boris Yeltsin's explaining to him humanity, a third leg is needed to help the table from collapsing into the garbage pit of history, which in turn is permanently collapsing into the garbage pit of the void. So take note, this is the equation, supply plus demand plus magic. And what is magic? Magic is epic, and it's also sex and Dionysian myths and play. And then Amalfitano is left alone in the dream. He's left alone and he didn't dare look down the hole, which meant he had no choice but to wait. So that hole comes back there too in terms of his reference.
But he's also hearing voices throughout this whole section. At one point, he's listening to the radio called Voice of the Border.
Yep.
And, you know, and you know, what is that border? It's interior, exterior, it's object and art. I mean, maybe this is a way to segue into the Readymade. And there's so much to say about this section, about, you know, language and comprehension, and he's such a weirdly passive character.
Yeah.
You know, you have in the first section these academics who are hell bent on finding someone they can't find, and here is a character who just waits for things to arrive. At him or for him. So should I describe the Readymade? I don't know how far back you step when you're.
Do it.
Yeah.
So in one of my favorite, well, this happens twice, this doubles, you know, referring back to your last conversation. There are two books that the status of which are sort of fuzzy or complicated. There's the Testamento Geometrico, which is a book he doesn't remember buying. And even if he can rationalize where it might have come from, it's impacted with his important books and he doesn't know why it's there. And I love his list of like trying to imagine how it might have ended up in a bag from a bookstore. And even, you know, there's that self-doubt and self-annulling, like maybe I was going to do a project about this and I forgot. You know, he can't sort of even penetrate his own thoughts. And because he sort of can't understand the book as a book, he takes it to his yard, which he surveys like a squire. He goes out and looks at his sort of cracked yard with no plants and shards of glass on the walls around it. He hangs it up on the clothesline with clothespins. And so he directly attributes this to Duchamp. And Marcel Duchamp, I guess I should say a little about who he was, right? Yeah. So he was an artist in the early 20th century, or early and mid 20th century, and he'd been a painter. And then after World War I, you know, World War I, to be very reductive, was so shattering and just sort of blew apart any old notions of order, of sort of localized peace, that a lot of things came apart. I mean, certainly politically, historically, but also in art and in literature. Like you found the omniscient narrator sort of started to splinter apart. And you had Virginia Woolf, and you had D.H. Lawrence and things like that. So after the war, Duchamp sort of felt like, why paint? What good is painting? How am I contributing anything with a painting? And he went to, well, which was the first one? Was it the bicycle wheel? I mean, he mounted a bicycle wheel to a stool and said, this is a work of art. And it's a work of art by virtue of me having taken this useful object and made it useless and given it a title, and voila. And it's funny because Twombly and Duchamp are among, in my experience, the two most frequent artists directed with the, my child could do that accusation, I guess it is. And I find them both so significant.
Yeah.
It says basically that something has meaning because an artist says it has meaning. The artist makes meaning. The artist pulls these objects out of the void and says these have meaning. So Amalfitano goes out a lot to look at the book hung on the clothesline. Oh, sorry, I should backtrack a little more. So the book on the Duchamp's book on the clothesline was something he was actually in Buenos Aires at the time, and he wrote to his sister, his sister, and told her to put a book, to hang out a book, and have it be, and that would be a ready-made. That would be, I guess, a wedding gift.
Wedding
and I'll put a picture of it. There are photographs of it. It's the only way that work exists anymore. I'll give you photographs of that. Okay. And the idea was that the wind moves through the pages and learns things and sort of transforms the book by virtue of being read by the wind. Amalfitano's book doesn't do much. Like the breeze blows through it, but it's this remarkably stable, like it's made of good materials. It doesn't really deteriorate. Maybe it gets covered in some dust. But it's almost like the opposite of Dorian Gray's portrait. Like Amalfitano goes to pieces, but the red pieces. Yeah. He says he uses it to gauge his moods, but it doesn't do much. So what else was I going to say about it? Oh, I guess there's another interesting thing about Duchamp and Buenos Aires is that he had this very sort of passé idea that he would go to Latin America, which was this pure place, this, quote unquote, primitive place. And he would sort of renew himself and refresh himself. And there's a drawing of a map that he did that has a big question mark over Buenos Aires. Like it is a sort of mystery to him. It's his kind of journey into the unknowable. And I think that he was disappointed. But I don't know, I think it's interesting that it was sort of his journey toward a void that turned out not to be one. So it's this incredibly like pregnant object in the middle of the book, but it kind of, does it tell you nothing? Or maybe it tells you a lot about him.
Interesting.
I'm not sure. I'd like to know what you think. I'm rambling on about it.
I don't know that I have a good answer to that right away, but I do know, or I'm curious of what you see between the connection between the book and his sudden drawings that he's making, like almost unconsciously.
Well, I think the drawings are charts, right? And charts are a way of making sense, but he's doing it unconsciously. It's almost like automatic writing. He looks down and he's made these charts with names he's forgotten.
Yeah.
Whitehead is one that I keep remembering. And then, Alan Bloom and Harold Bloom appear. So it's like the subconscious jokes come out as well. And I constantly have the sense of him in this section trying to make sense. And you don't even really know sense of what, although there's this kind of menace of every time his daughter goes out, the tension of waiting for her to return because it's so dangerous with all the murders out there. I was going to talk about the artist Mark Lombardi and his charts, but now I'm not so sure it's relevant here.
I have a crackpot theory for you. about the book is that throughout this section, he's aware that there is extreme violence or hatred beneath the surface. Like beneath every surface, there's this great violence. Even so far as like when the dean's son takes him up from mezcal, he like then is like, I like to go get my ass kicked, or like, like and they connect over when they're at the party, and Amalfitano sees the rector's wife like look at him with hate. And so does the dean's son. And so there's this like simmering hatred everywhere, this sort of void everywhere. And at the same time, like geometry is supposed to be the one thing that's unchanging. It is fixed. It is the real. It is not moving. And the book not being destroyed sort of almost seems like that is the kind of, the reality of it is the reality of this hatred that's everywhere. That's just, and then his other book that he's reading, the one that you mentioned that has like the weird history to it, which might be fake or not, is about the liberation of Chile, but like who O'Higgins was, and if he was actually like special native Chilean and had like special gifts or whatnot. And that book is also sort of weird in that it's about communication and about like what was real and what wasn't, and if that book is real, but also as an example of colonialism and back against. So they all sort of like circle around, but I wonder if the geometry to me has always been one of those, like, anytime we talk about math is unwavering in some ways. Like it explains the world, but doesn't give it a meaning. It just gives it a, like I just finished reading that Labutap or whatever his name is, When We Cease to Understand the World, the finalist for the National Book Award, about like science stuff. And there's a whole section in there about like the wave theory that Schrodinger comes up with. That's like the most elegant mathematical equation to exist in the 20th century. And yet there's no possible way to understand it. Like it's just not, it goes beyond our mental capacity, but predicts everything and is real. And I think that kind of tension between what is real and unmoving and what he's trying to understand is kind of runs throughout this too. That's my crackpot theory that came up with.
No, that's not crackpot. I think I'm sort of embarrassed I didn't grab that. But the other thing in the Benjamin Labutoup book is the Japanese mathematician with A plus B equals C, and he writes hundreds and hundreds of pages. And I didn't know if that was a joke or not. I mean, it seems like you could, I don't know. It seems like there could be a lot to say about A plus B equals C. But something so fundamentally reducible doesn't actually reduce anything.
No. Very interesting.
So what do we take, like the fact that Amalfitano, when he's drawing these diagrams and these geometric shapes, and then he's just putting down the names that are coming to him. And it seems to be just sort of like by what he comes up with by chance. You know, what is this? Is this sort of like, is this a joke from Bolaño? You know, I'm looking at like on my page 193 when he's saying, you know, he does the first 3 drawings, and then he says, the only possible explanation for drawing 1 was boredom. Drawing 2 seemed an extension of drawing 1. The names he had added struck him as insane. Xenocrates made sense, but there was a fleeting logic there. And Protagoras too. But why Thomas More and Saint Simon? Why Diderot? What was he doing there? And God in heaven? Why the Portuguese Jesuit Pedro de Fonseca? It's like, you know, is this just kind of like a little wink and a nod about erudition as well? Like what all of this erudition is just random. Like it makes as much sense as like drawing a triangle and writing down the names that come to your mind. Like the knowledge, I think going back to this idea of the ordering and of the collection and the you know, with the intent to make sense and to leave knowledge, the production of knowledge, right? Which is the academy, and the description of the University of Santa Teresa is that it's like a cemetery or an empty dance club. Yeah. So I think this section 2 is a real like jab at sort of at the attempt to create order and create systems of knowledge that are lasting and that are not ultimately sort of just random, like the random spewing of names from, you know, the depths of your learned memory. And this is something that I've been thinking a lot about in this chapter, which is that this chapter seems to me like so postmodern and the really sort of classic postmodern cultural studies sort of example. And I think, you know, we're beyond the postmodern moment, but this idea of sort of, you have this intellectual, you have this professor of philosophy whose, you know, life has been based and ordered around knowledge, the production of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge, right? As a university professor, and he's unable to grasp the sense of what's happening around him, sort of like the complete failure of, I don't know, of our way of controlling truth, I guess, or producing knowledge. I feel like there's some really serious fracturing that's happening there.
I have another crackpot theory about the drawing. Is that,
Okay.
as you're saying that is Bolaño playing a joke, is that it would be very easy to research each one of these names and to put together some connective points between why is Diderot on the bottom and Thomas More on top, fake utopias, and like where this comes from, but that would be someone generating an explanation for it. That this is like the Olympian creative that you can then write through, but it doesn't have to mean anything, but you could make it. You could. There's no doubt in my mind that if you went through each one of these names and did some research on what their things were, you could find some way to connect them. And
well, I'm sure that these drawings I'm sure that they're in someone's PhD dissertation.
Somebody's
on contemporary Latin American literature. And I think, I mean, isn't that sort of all, I don't know, of art criticism too. And I guess this is, I do not have a background in art history or criticism, except for what I've gleaned through sort of my other critical studies in literature. But again, you know, I think that interpretation, I think that's sort of a bit of subverting the idea of our ability to properly interpret not only what is reality around us, but then to interpret ideas, literature, art, that there seems to be like some subversion or just some sort of like painting it as absurd as well. Which, you know, who knows if that was really Bolaño's stance, but it certainly points to a resistance to allow for a single interpretation.
He says that Amalfitano says, I think he says this to Rosa. I don't want to, this is my husband's book, so I don't want to write in it. So I've taken.
You're so good.
He was a little angry about the bashed up, so I decided I wouldn't write in it. But at one point, I think he tells Rosa that the book is out there to see if it learns something about real life.
Yeah.
And I love the line about like the wind blows through it to see if it would tell the wind about being the wind.
Yes.
And so
yes.
I wonder, as I was thinking, as you were putting forward all those really good ideas, is there a difference between the production of knowledge and the production of meaning? And now I'm interested in Edwin Johns, because Edwin Johns was producing meaning, but if you cut off your arm, you stop. Like, was there some futility even in making meaning? I mean, without Johns, I would say, well, for Bolaño, obviously making meaning in art is more important, seems more important than making knowledge, but even Johns like has to stop.
There is also that balance in here between the creation of knowledge and the obsession with understanding and knowledge while you're surrounded by like these endless deaths. Not to jump too far ahead, but like the femicide and that's real, and everything else that we're sort of doing is like not addressing something that's a true horror of the moment. There's an essay that I've referenced before from The Believer by Gideon Lewis Krauss about MLA. It's basically mocking the MLA conference, and part of it was that everyone at the MLA is like, well, what we do has nothing to do with real life. Like what we're doing is just like completely separate, and then it doesn't matter. It doesn't inform my life at all, these kind of studies. And that like really unnerves him in the essay, but it seems kind of to fit in here a little bit too. I think
What?
I am going to have to go in a second.
Okay.
But you say what you're going to say, Katie, and then let's talk about the long cut. And then you need to come back on, Emily.
Yes.
Yeah. I have
You
so
could
much
just
more
come-
to say.
Yes. Why don't you come on tomorrow for
Thursday?
like just the regular session?
Let's talk further about that.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to read one quick little thing and then that we can kind of chew over. But this is from the beginning of the section of this part. And it's when Lola is talking with Dr. Gorka, who's the physician at
Yes.
Mondragon, at the insane asylum. And he says eventually, like, we're all going to leave Mondragon. Eventually, we're all going to be out of the insane asylum, right? This noble institution. It will be abandoned. And then my biography will be of interest and I'll be able to publish it. But in the meantime, as you can imagine, it's my duty to collect information, dates, names, confirm stories, and some in questionable taste, even damaging, others more picturesque, stories that revolve around a chaotic center of gravity, which is our friend here, or what he's willing to reveal. The ordered self he presents, ordered verbally, I mean, according to a strategy I think I understand, although its purpose is a mystery to me, an order concealing a verbal disorder that would shake us to the core if we ever were to experience it, even as spectators of a staged performance. And I know we don't have time to go into that, but maybe we can talk about that tomorrow, Chad. But again, like we're talking again, the idea of the stage of the performance of being a spectator, of producing, of cataloging, collecting, producing stories, and basically like this attempt to create order around
Something awful.
Something awful and a disorder, basically, yeah, like our attempts to, I guess, order the mystery. And we're all standing around some center of gravity that's pulling us right to a core.
And then
That
what
would
does
leave us
the poet
shaken.
do? The poet devolves into cliches at the end,
Yep.
which I can't remember what they are, but which was shocking in context.
Yep. Yeah. It's really cool. Really, there's so much to say. Emily, I hope you come back and join us. I'm sure you will. This was so wonderful. And thank you for your explanations and your insight. And that bit of history there is really fascinating. And I think will definitely help contextualize for our listeners and for people who are reading along, sort of what is going on with what is happening with the placement of this text on the clothesline and all the things that could open up onto. It was fabulous.
Thank you.
Also, everyone
Thank you.
should order Emily's book, The Long Cut, coming from Delkey Archive in May of 2022. I don't know if you have a good elevator pitch for it. I could, but I don't.
Well, it's the story of an artist who can't figure out what her work is.
There we go.
And that she's presented with this work where any material can be used for art, and art can be about anything. And she's looking at artists all around her who have landed on what their work is, and they're doing it and they're sure about it, and she can't figure it out. So it's a sort of continuous line of thought in which she encounters her day and she encounters the world and tries to figure out how it translates into art. It is also about the production of meaning and how you decide how to produce meaning. And it goes
it sounds wonderful.
And then it comes back from the dark place. So.
And the syntax is amazing. The writing is amazing. It is very unique and very incredible.
Thank you.
Very, very, very fun to read. So everyone pre-order that.
Short.
Short. I did in my class yesterday, we did readers reports and someone said my book was 345 pages. I'm like, fucking no, out. And like, too long. Not doing that.
Too long.
But
Too long.
anyways, thanks for joining us and hopefully you'll be back soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Thanks, Chad.